You're listening to the Mississippi Outdoors Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Wyatt. You've been walking around in your yard or out in the woods and stumbled across a mushroom, and you've wondered, could I eat that? We're going to talk with someone today who's an expert who knows whether or not you could or should eat that mushroom. He is Jason Hoeksema, professor of biology from Ole Miss, on the podcast.
Mississippi Outdoors is sponsored by Entergy Mississippi. Entergy is building a stronger and cleaner grid to power a brighter future and protect our great outdoors for generations to come.
You're listening to the Mississippi Outdoors Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Wyatt. With us today, Jason Hoeksema, professor of biology at Ole Miss. Thanks for being here, Jason.
Glad to be here. Thanks.
And when I say professor of biology, naturally we think mushrooms, right? Native mushrooms, not necessarily, but I wanted to talk to you, and Chip and I were talking. Within the last decade, he read an article that you wrote for the Mississippi Outdoors magazine about native mushrooms and that kind of thing here in Mississippi. So, do you get asked about that a lot, like in general conversation with what you do?
Well, yeah, more and more. I think the last decade has actually been a period when more and more people are interested in fungi and mushrooms in the forest. And so I get asked those kinds of questions more often than you would think.
Okay, yeah. So just kind of as a starter, everyday citizen, hunter, fisherman, guy who likes sports, taxpayer, why should I be interested in wild mushrooms in Mississippi? Why?
Well, there's all kinds of reasons. One of them is that a lot of the wild mushrooms in Mississippi are edible, and they can make your kitchen more interesting place. They can make your meals more fun. Sometimes there's a lot of great overlap with other outdoor and sporting activities. So, for example, I've got a friend in Oxford who is an avid turkey hunter. But he's also the person in my area that knows the most about where to find wild morels.
Okay.
Morels are a kind of mushroom that I grew up eating in Michigan, and people crave them around here who know about them because they're delicious. But they're hard to find.
Okay.
And that's because they only grow during a short period of time in late March and early April. And they're out in forested areas, but they blend in with the soil so they can be hard to see. But picture, who's a person that who does a lot of walking around in the forest in late March and early April? Well, it's a turkey hunter. And what better thing to do, especially if you're not finding any turkeys, than kind of keep an eye out for mushrooms. So, the best is when you get a turkey and you find a bunch of morels, and now you've got a really interesting meal. Same thing with chanterelles. Chanterelles are these bright orange, really abundant mushrooms that are easy to find, especially in the summer in Mississippi. And those can be cooked and eaten with all kinds of meals. They work great with eggs. So in an omelet or with scrambled eggs, they really go great with pasta, in general with dairy products and onions and chicken. And so you can mix them with all kinds of things, and they add color and they add interesting flavors from the woods. So, just being on the lookout for some of the most common edible mushrooms can really add to the diversity of things that you might harvest from a natural area. I guess secondly, even if you're not comfortable eating wild mushrooms, even if you're not interested in that aspect of it, wild mushrooms are really cool. They're beautiful, colorful organisms. They range in colors from, as I mentioned, bright orange to some of them are jet black, some of them are brown and lumpy, and some of them are blue, bright blue colors, and everything in between. And they have different shapes and sizes and textures. They're doing different things out there, which we can get into, but they're just really interesting ecologically. They're interacting with the environment in interesting ways. They're growing on and in things. And so if you start noticing wild mushrooms, it can be a way of just appreciating the environment around you. So
sure,
if you're out for a hike, you're out walking around with your dogs, you're out hunting, you're out doing whatever you like to do, it just provides something else to look at and to enjoy in nature.
Okay, and the first two you mentioned, morel, right, and chanterelle. Did I get that right?
Yep.
And so those two that are not only safe to eat but good to eat, throughout Mississippi they're found, or certain areas?
Yeah, they are. Morels are a bit of a northern mushroom, and they get more and more common the further north you go away from Mississippi, in fact, and they get a bit hard to find down here. So they're localized, they've got their spots, and you really have to spend a lot of time tromping around, and especially in bottomland areas in Mississippi, to find a good spot. And the further south you go in Mississippi, the harder it gets to find those. Chanterelles are pretty easy to find throughout the state. The season for those will shift a little bit north to south, depending on where you are in the state, but they're pretty easy to find throughout, even down by the coast.
Okay.
But that said, the chanterelle is very much associated with hardwood trees. So in our state, anyhow, I tend to find them with oaks and hickories especially, and that's generally true. So if you're in a pine forest in Mississippi, you're not going to find them. So some habitats, like down by the coast in the coastal plain pine savannas down there, you're not going to find chanterelles. Out in grassland areas, you're not going to find them. But wherever you've got hardwood forest, you can find them in the state.
Okay. And you mentioned the bright orange color.
Mm-hmm.
So just out of curiosity, are there, non-safe, non-edible mushrooms that look similar to the chanterelle? Are they hard to tell apart from, others?
It's a good question. It's an important question. We want to be safe. And one thing I'll be more specific about is that chanterelles grow on the ground, first of all. They don't grow out of stumps.
Okay.
They don't grow off the side of a tree. They're only going to be in the ground, in the soil. And they don't grow in clusters where there's, 7 or 8 of them all stemming out from the same point. They grow separately. There might be a whole bunch of them in a certain area, but they're going to grow as separate stems. There are some other orange mushrooms that'll grow in clusters, especially from stumps. There's some orange mushrooms that can get pretty big that grow out of dead wood or out of the base of a tree, and you want to avoid those. Those are interesting to look at, but you want to not eat them. Chanterelles are generally growing single. They tend to be kind of trumpet-shaped, flaring out as you go from the bottom to the top. They have very firm flesh, but when you break them open, they're kind of white on the inside.
Okay.
And then the final key characteristic to look for is that they don't really have true gills. So on a standard mushroom that you might buy, like a portobello at the grocery store, you look on the underside of the cap, and it's got those thin, soft little blades. That's where the spores are made, and those are called gills.
Okay.
And a lot of mushrooms have those, but chanterelles don't have them. They might have some lines, some ridges, some like kind of grooves running down the underside of the cap, but that's at the most. They're not going to have those nice, soft, thin blade-like gills. So if you find a firm orange mushroom growing by itself on the forest floor, and it's got all those characteristics, there's very little chance that you're going to mix it up with something. It is also pretty easy to identify from a photo. So find someone who knows a little more than you do and text them a photo. Folks are welcome to email me a quick photo and just verify. And it's a good idea to verify with an expert before you eat any wild mushroom. There are poisonous ones, and so you got to be careful. But the nice thing is that chanterelles, once you get an eye for them, it's really hard to mix them up with anything else.
Okay. All right. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you mentioned poisonous ones. Are there any, I don't know, famous or well-known or prevalent poisonous ones that we see a lot in Mississippi? Yeah.
Well, one example is the green spored parasol mushroom, which is a really common one that grows in people's yards. It's a really robust looking white one. Probably seen it.
Yeah.
They pop up after a lot of rain out of the grass, and they get really pretty big across. And those are poisonous, although they're not deadly. They tend to make you sick for maybe a few hours or a day, and you're throwing up. But as long as you stay hydrated, you're going to be fine.
My dog likes to eat those.
Yeah.
How does it affect him, Chip?
So I had 2 dogs at the time. It was a Chihuahua and a wiener dog, and they were basically just taking turns
Uh-huh.
throwing up on my floor. So
Yeah.
So they did get sick.
yeah,
but,
both of them got
but
sick.
not too
Yeah.
bad. Yeah. So that'll happen with kids too. You know, kids will be crawling around the yard and just put whatever in their mouths. And, you know, if they eat that, they're going to be ill and you're going to be worried, but they're probably going to be okay. But that is the most common poison. That's the most common culprit for mushroom poisonings in the whole United States. And we have plenty of them here in Mississippi. And partly it happens because they look like a store-bought mushroom. They kind of look like a fresh mushroom that might find in the grocery store. That underscores an important point, which is that you can't tell the edibility of a mushroom just by looking at whether it looks edible. That's not a thing. Looking edible or looking poisonous, you cannot do that. What you have to do is you have to learn to identify which species it is. It's just like botany or like duck hunting. You know, you can't shoot a duck until you know that that's a species you're allowed to shoot, right?
Yeah, right.
Specific species. You can't look at it and think, well, that looks legal to me. Well,
Right.
what does that mean, right?
Some homework's got to take place.
Right. Is it a canvasback? Is it a green-winged teal? What have you? So same thing with mushrooms. You've got to be able to look at it and say, all right, that's a chanterelle, and I know that that's edible because there are reliable sources of information to tell me that that's edible. There's dozens of other edible species of mushrooms as well in Mississippi, and dozens of poisonous ones. And the way to figure all that out is to learn how to identify them, figure out which species you've got.
Okay. Are mushrooms, just in general, different types, are they a food source for wildlife?
Yeah, absolutely. And some wildlife has more ability to digest and tolerate the chemicals in those mushrooms than humans do. Excuse me. So, for example, I've seen box turtles just chowing down on those green spored parasol mushrooms. They'll crawl up in your yard and eat big chunks out of them. And there are other animals that really love to eat them as well. Slugs and snails will eat a lot of them. The larvae of all kinds of insects will eat them like crazy, and bigger animals too. Deer will eat mushrooms, and a lot of those animals seem to be able to tolerate some of the more mild toxins more than humans can.
Okay.
Yeah.
A little story to qualify a question I was thinking of as you were talking. Several years ago, I was with some people in Georgia that have a huge pecan orchard, a huge pecan business. And they have a truffle sniffing dog, a dog that can go into the pecan orchard, especially where the older trees are, and can smell the truffles underneath the ground. And then they bring up those pecan truffles. Yeah. And it's a very, it's like a delicacy, the pecan truffle oil and the way that it's used. Is a truffle like that? Is it in the mushroom family? Is it related?
Yeah, truffles are a kind of mushroom. So truffles more broadly are basically a mushroom that has evolved to stay below ground like a potato. So instead of opening up and having a cap and a stalk where it shoots its spores into the air, spores are the little microscopic seed-like cells that allow a mushroom or another fungus to get from one place to another. Truffles have a different strategy, right? So they have evolved to stay closed up like a little potato, but what they do is they develop really attractive smells. They emit these volatile chemicals that work their way up through the soil and smell very interesting to mammals. They smell like fruit. They smell like other kinds of food. Some of them even mimic sexual pheromones to make a mammal think that there's a mate down there somewhere. And mammals will dig them up then and eat them. And it's evolved so that the mammal gets some nutrition out of it. So there's some calories, but then through the digestion process, the spores survive and they get pooped out the other end. And that mammal has meanwhile walked somewhere, and then it leaves the spores there, and they're kind of fertilized and they're ready to go through the rest of their life cycle. So truffles are really fascinating in that they've co-evolved with both trees attached to the roots of the trees and with the mammals for dispersal. So truffles are an example, like chanterelles as well, of a mycorrhizal mushroom, which is one that it only can get its carbon to build its body from a tree. So they attach to the roots of trees and they grow out as a web into the soil. And then occasionally they make these truffles to disperse themselves. But meanwhile, they're living on the roots of the trees. And that's what's going on with the pecan trees there. And I'm glad you brought that up because we have those in Mississippi.
Yeah.
And we've done a little bit of work on that in my research lab. I had a student a few years ago who investigated it out in the Delta in some pecan orchards there. And we took samples from roots from pecan trees from a couple different places up in Tunica County and then further south as well. And she extracted the DNA from the roots and we sequenced it and we found that those roots had the pecan truffle on them.
On the roots.
On the roots.
Wow.
So we found the mycorrhizal. That's like the symbiotic structure where the truffle fungus is attached to the tree. We didn't actually find any truffles themselves because I think we mainly just didn't get out there at the right time of year.
Okay.
You have to time it right. The truffles only fruit during a certain time of year. We think it's probably in the late fall.
Okay.
But we haven't quite found the right window yet. I even went so far as to train my dogs to help us. And they got pretty good at it with the practice truffles in the yard. So I obtained some of these pecan truffles from a guy in North Carolina. We practiced in my yard, and it's like any scent training. If you've done that with a dog, where you have to gradually build it up. But what we did is put the truffles inside a plastic container with holes in it so that the smell could come out. And then first it was throwing it and getting them to, chase it and then find it with their nose just on the surface. And once, especially Charlie got good at it, we started covering it with some pine needles and see if he could still find it. Mm-hmm. And then we started digging holes and burying it a little bit. And he got good at it. Find the truffle was the command. And he could do it when we were practicing. So I know he's got the scent for it. But then when we went out into the into the pecan orchards in the Delta, we didn't have any success yet. But I'd love to get back to it and try some different times of year because I think that's the key.
That's the key.
Yeah.
This was South Georgia, just on the other side of the Alabama line, just north of the Florida line. So extreme southwest Georgia, really sandy soil for the most part down there. And what I do remember is watching that. It was a black lab, finding those pecan truffles, and they were really shallow. Like it was not and I guess is that typical or what you'd expect for that kind of thing? It's not.
Yeah.
This was like really shallow under the surface that he was finding.
That might not be unusual. I think different species of truffles fruit at different depths.
Okay.
In a pecan orchard, one thing that's different from a wild forest is that it typically has a thinner layer of leaf litter and other decomposing stuff because a lot of that gets either trampled or sort of scattered or swept out in a pecan orchard. So a lot of truffles will fruit just at the top of the soil, but buried under a layer of leaf litter. But in a pecan orchard, that stuff might be exposed, and so it's easy. It's actually easier to find them there than in a wild forest.
Makes total sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so and I have to ask. Another realm of mushrooms that we hear about either down the line or in conversation are the narcotic, I guess, kind would be what. So that type of mushroom, in the state of Mississippi, I mean, does that exist? Does it exist naturally, or is that where it's coming from? Like, where do we even begin that conversation?
Yeah. Well, so just to clarify, what you're talking about is mushrooms that have psilocybin in them. This is the chemical that is it's very similar to what's found in LSD, and it causes hallucinogenic effects if you take enough of it. And the mushrooms that have that are fairly diverse, but a lot of them are in the genus Psilocybe, and that genus has several species that are found in Mississippi.
Okay.
And they're fairly common. There's some species that are more associated with cattle pastures. There are others that grow more in sort of disturbed soils. I've got one that grows around my house in Oxford. And it's fairly common. And that's a species that's kind of mostly in Mexico, but it grows up into the southeast as well in red dirt kind of soils.
Yeah.
So they're all over the place. And Yeah, it's a really interesting group of mushrooms. That there's a lot of interest in them. You may know that there's a lot of current research going on their potential therapeutic benefits, and that's really interesting to me. There's this whole sort of recreational side of things that I think gave them a bad rap for a long time, but there's also really promising research results that are coming out looking at those chemicals and their ability to treat really difficult diseases and disorders like depression and anxieties, addictions that have proven really difficult to treat with conventional drugs. They are showing in preliminary trials to be much more effective than some of the existing drugs. And so, that research I think is really promising. Also, those chemicals are not very addictive compared to a lot of drugs that are on the market, and also compared to a lot of recreational drugs that people use. So it's a really interesting area to keep an eye on in the coming years.
Yeah. Where does someone, you mentioned earlier that I could even take a picture and email it to you and to get an ID. With that or around that, where does someone begin to kind of learn on their own? Is it simply just, I'm going to Google or what do you suggest?
Yeah, there are a combination of options. So, one is I really recommend getting a good book. And because those books are really nice, they have a set of photos that you can just kind of page through at your leisure and get to recognize these different species. They also have introductions that have like a 20, 30, 50-page section that's all about how to do it, how to go about identifying mushrooms. It has good diagrams. So there's a couple of books. There's one called Mushrooms of the Southeast. It's a smaller, more pocket-sized book. There's another one that's bigger, a little bit bigger, called Mushrooms of the Gulf Coast States. And those are great books, and I recommend one or both of them. That's a good place to start. The other option, too, is there's a Facebook page that's really active called Mushrooms of Mississippi. So if you're on Facebook, you can go there and you can just read the posts and see what people are talking about. Because, certain seasons, people start posting photos of certain species they're finding. And then you can learn from that dialogue. Experts will answer and say, I think it's this, and here's why. And just by reading it, you can learn a lot. But you can also post your own photos there and say, hey, I found this. I think it might be this. What do you guys think? And then people will respond. It's a really helpful, really active community. It's got thousands of people. It's really pleasant surprise, to see how many people have become interested in that topic and are jumping on that Facebook page. Occasionally there are workshops that you can go to. I teach one annually at the Lee Tart Nature Preserve in Grenada. So you can go to the Facebook for Friends of Chakchuma Swamp, or look up Robin Whitfield's Facebook page and get that on your calendar. It just did it this past Saturday, so it's usually in June because right now is such a good time typically to look for wild mushrooms. So keep an eye out for that. And then, try to find someone who's good at it or who knows what they're doing and go out with them. That's the best, is just get out in the field and practice. But you can do a lot on your own. Pick some mushrooms, bring them home, and get one of those books and read through it and start trying to match up what you're finding with what's in the book.
Yeah, very cool. How did, obviously, you're a professor of biology, you've written on this and studied it, but how did you get into, an interest in mushrooms particularly? Like, was there a genesis type of moment for you at somewhere where you went, this is really something I want to study?
Yeah. Well, I think it happened kind of during graduate school. I was a graduate student at the University of California in Davis, and I was studying plants, and I was trying to understand how plants compete with each other and how they might sometimes have beneficial interactions with each other, and how that all plays out to determine which plants we find in a forest or in a grassland. And the more I read, the more I understood that, the big ideas about how that all works were mostly ignoring these below ground interactions, these organisms that are really common on, more than 90% of plants have these mycorrhizal fungi on their roots that grow out into the soil and do most of the nutrient scavenging for the plant, and then give those nutrients back to the plant, some of them. And plants provide all the sugars that these fungi need to grow. And it's a fundamental relationship that most plants engage in. And yet all these ideas about how plant communities work, we're kind of ignoring those interactions. And I thought, that's an area that is really fertile for, further research. And so that got me interested in these mycorrhizal interactions. And I started thinking about, well, what kind of plants and fungi should I study if I'm going to study this? And I got some advice pretty early on to try to work on fungi and plants that are macroscopic, that you can see and touch, and that'll make your life easier in certain ways. And so I kind of went that direction of working with pine trees and the mycorrhizal fungi associated with pine trees, because I knew I could do experiments with them, and I could put different combinations together and see what happened, and I could look at them and grow them in the laboratory. So I started doing that during graduate school, and as soon as I started doing that, I realized that in order to do my research, it would really help to be able to identify mushrooms, because most of the mycorrhizal fungi on a tree make mushrooms. And so there's a below ground component that's kind of invisible to the naked eye. They're microscopic, these fungi growing in the soil, you can't see them. But when they colonize a root, you can see a little cluster of hyphae that is on the root. But then when they pop up and make a mushroom, that's when you can really see them. So it's kind of cool because it has this microscopic side that's sort of mysterious, but it also has this really obvious, charismatic, colorful thing that it makes. And I really liked that aspect of it, that there's this part that you can see and touch. Also, I love food. I love eating. I love cooking. My wife does too. And so, it just also, the more I learned about them, I realized there's a side benefit of learning how to identify all these mushrooms, is that I can sometimes find really good edible ones to bring into the kitchen and just add to a meal. So this was all happening in California. And as I moved to being a postdoc, I was doing research at the University of California in Santa Cruz on the coast of Mississippi. And there's some beautiful places there to hunt mushrooms. Also, that's where I was doing my research, in the pine forests on the coast of Mississippi. And there you can find chanterelles, but you can also find big boletes, these mushrooms called porcinis or king boletes. And they're big, and they have this amazing smell. And when you dry them, they smell even better. And I started finding those, and that was really fun.
And they're edible?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Delicious and edible. And so that just drove my interest in them even further. And there in Santa Cruz, California, there was a mushroom club called the Fungus Federation of Santa Cruz. And they had weekly or monthly, depending on the time of year, little workshops where you could bring your mushrooms that you found to the public library, and there'd be people sitting around with tables, and just experts who would walk around and help you identify your mushrooms. So you could bring them and look at a book and think, okay, I think maybe this is that species, and someone else could, an expert would come around and help verify, and that was really helped get me on the right track as well. So it just has all kinds of angles to it. I also find mushroom hunting to be really, really therapeutic. Really, it's just a fun, healthy activity because you're walking around in the woods. You can bring your dogs. Even if you don't find any mushrooms, the worst that happens is you took a nice walk in the woods. And that's a great thing about it too.
Yeah, that's really cool. So a morel mushroom, you've found them wild and eaten them in Mississippi.
Yeah.
How would, give me one suggestion of what would be a great way to bring them into the kitchen and use them? You touched on it really early, a couple of basic examples, but what might you do? Yeah.
If you're lucky enough to find morels, a great way to use them is to make a risotto out of them. So morels preserve really well with drying. So if you dry them out on a food dehydrator, just put layers of them on a food dehydrator, dry them out overnight. Then you can store them in a jar for months or years, and they get even a little better as they kind of age. And then you've got those dried mushrooms. You can use them you can rehydrate them to make a liquid, and that liquid is like a stock. It's like a mushroom stock. So you can use that to make soups and stews. And then you've got the rehydrated mushrooms that can be chopped up and used in anything as well. But that liquid, then if you use that as your liquid for a risotto, so, for listeners who have made risotto before, you know that what you're doing is you take arborio rice and you saute it a little bit with some butter and onions, but then you just start adding liquid to it, and it'll absorb whatever kind of stock or liquid you put on it, whether it's just water or mushroom water. And so make some morel mushroom water with your rehydrating your morels and use that to make the risotto, and then make a mushroom sauce with your chopped up mushrooms to put on that, and it's delicious. It also really they just work great if you saute them with some butter and salt and pepper, and maybe add some flour and a little liquid to make a gravy with them. It works great as a sauce for a steak or for any kind of wild game. So friends that of mine that hunt, they'll make just a morel sauce and use that to kind of dress some turkey or whatever game you've got.
Yeah, it's really fascinating.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to go to school here a little bit. You've mentioned this term several times, and I think I'm saying it correctly. Mycorrhizal. Did I say that correctly?
Yeah.
Mycorrhizal fungi.
Yeah.
So when you've mentioned it, you're referring to sort of that's the microscopic sort of makeup of what produces these above ground mushrooms that I see.
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay.
I would say that in a forest, most of the mushrooms are from mycorrhizal fungi. Mycorrhizal is one of the strategies that fungi have. It's one of the lifestyles of a fungus for how they get their carbon and their other nutrients that they need. In contrast, there's another major one, probably the other major lifestyle for a mushroom and other fungi is to be a decomposer. And you eat only dead stuff then. You get your carbon, all your sugars only from eating, say, dead wood or leaf litter or even, dead animals, anything dead.
Okay.
You eat it and then absorb what you need from it. And there's a lot of fungi that do that. So you have your mycorrhizal fungi and you've got your decomposer fungi. And both of those make mushrooms. So, for example, your green spored parasol mushroom in the yard, that's a decomposer.
Okay.
And morels are decomposers. Chanterelles are mycorrhizal. And that's useful to know and understand for practical reasons as well, because certain species of mushrooms, then you can think about, all right, what's the plant, if it's mycorrhizal, what's the tree or other plant that they are growing with? And that'll help you find them, right?
Okay.
So if you're looking for chanterelles, you can look for their trees that they grow with, which is the oaks and hickories. In California, if you want to find porcini mushrooms, in the Central Valley of California, you'd look for oak, valley oak trees. If you're over by the coast, you might find them with oaks or with pines. So it helps to understand that ecology in order to find them. And then the third strategy, if you're a fungus, is to be a parasite and attack living things, but not in a beneficial way where you're exchanging, like a mycorrhizal fungus exchanges nutrients to the plant and gets sugars in return. A parasitic fungus is only taking and not giving. They're taking and maybe killing the host. So a classic example of this is like a athlete's foot fungus, but worse yet, you can have some infections in your lungs. But also there are fungi that eat things like fruit. They'll attack living fruit trees and attack the fruit on a tree. There are a lot of them that attack insects that are really fascinating. The cordyceps mushroom is one that some people are learning more about these days, partly because of this show called The Last of Us, which is a very popular series.
Yeah.
So that's about, that's based on a true type of fungus. The cordyceps in its natural state attacks an insect like an ant, and the spores will get on the ant and grow into the body of the ant and grow to the brain and then control the body of the ant. So causing it to climb its way up a plant and then die at the top of the plant. And then a little mushroom sprouts out of the head of the ant and shoots the spores out all over the environment where it might land on another ant. And it's fascinating behavior and strategy. The Last of Us is based on the idea that fungus has jumped onto humans and now is doing this to humans and controlling their behavior and turning them into zombies. Basically, it's the mushroom zombie television series.
Yeah, but in reality, then what you're saying is, there's good fungus and bad fungus.
Yeah, you can think of it that way.
You can think of it because, okay, again, elementary thinking over here, but like in the movie Christmas Vacation, when Audrey says to her brother, they're having to share a bed, and she says, "Get off me, you little fungus." So she meant the bad one, not the good. Not all fungus is bad.
No, and I would agree with that in the general terms, but on the other hand, even the ones that are parasitic, in a broad sense, they play an important role in an ecosystem. So, for example, any disease organism like a fungus helps to, in some ways, create biodiversity, because if an ant species starts to get out of control and become super abundant, well, one control on that is for it to be attacked by a disease. And in fact, the more an ant or another species gets really abundant, the more susceptible it is to disease. And so that disease organism will help drive it back down. And then once it's less abundant, then it's free from disease, and it can go back and forth. That kind of keeps everything in balance overall.
That's really fascinating.
I had a few questions. So these microscopic mushrooms, we can find them everywhere, is basically what you were saying. It's something I've never even thought about.
Yeah, there are spores of fungi, floating around in this room. And that just happens in any building. It's not a problem. It's just normal. So we're breathing in some small amount of fungal spores all the time. It only becomes a problem if it's in really high concentration or if it's a particular species that's toxic, but they're all over the place.
So the other thing I was going to ask is, I've heard that, during like certain times of the year, or maybe every multiple years, you'll see certain types of mushrooms. Do they when they're like traversing, are the spores carried with I guess the currents in the atmosphere, and does that play into where they're going to show up in certain geographical locations? Can you kind of elaborate on that?
Yeah, well, those spores definitely can travel long distances. There isn't a lot of research on, sampling up in the atmosphere to see how many spores are flying around up there. But the more we look, the more we find those spores almost everywhere. So a lot of fungi are traveling very long distances, and yet we don't find all species everywhere. They can be very localized, and so there are limits to that dispersal. And certain species are very adapted to local places, and so we do tend to find species have restricted ranges. There are, certain fungal species that we only find in the southeastern U.S., others that we only find in Europe, and they're geographically isolated from each other enough that they've become genetically separate species. But they do have the capability of traveling quite a distance. Where we find them in Mississippi and when, that is affected by their dispersal, but it's also affected by the kind of environment that we have and where they're adapted to grow.
Okay, the last question I have, it's another dog question. Somehow my dog will always find the stinkiest spot in the yard and will try to, coat his neck in it so he smells bad too. And I'm assuming that what he's finding is the remnants of a dead mushroom in the yard.
Well, that's possible, but there are a lot of stinky substances that dogs zero in on, and I wouldn't be surprised if it was often something else as well, like where another dog has peed or, who knows. And, when things rot, it's not just fungi that are decomposing those things. It's also often bacteria, and bacteria can be very stinky as well, and sometimes more so. And so especially, I would guess, in fact, that stinky bacteria are often the culprit when a dog is really zeroing on something it really likes to roll in. Yeah.
Regarding kind of back to where we started, the edible version, the edible and non-hallucinogenic, version of the wild mushrooms that we have in Mississippi. Are there some that do grow on a stump or on the side of a tree that are edible?
Yeah, good question. So there are quite a lot, and quite a lot that are easy to identify and really delicious as well. Some of my favorites tend to grow in December, kind of late fall, early winter. For example, the oyster mushroom is a really common one. I always participate in several Christmas bird counts in mid to late December, and I always am on the lookout for oyster mushrooms during those events because we almost always find them. And oyster mushrooms tend to be a pale whitish color on the surface, and they grow in these overlapping clusters on dead wood.
Yeah.
It can be a standing dead tree or a downed log, but they can be very big and heavy, and they grow in these big overlapping clusters. They tend to drop spores on each other and on the ground that look kind of whitish or lavender colored. And they have a kind of an oyster shape. They're sort of oval.
Yeah.
And they don't really have a distinctive stem. They can sometimes have a little bit of a lateral pseudo stem kind of growing off sideways. And they have a soft mushroom-like texture. A lot of mushrooms that grow on wood are tough and corky and leathery. Yeah. Those are called polypores. And they have just holes underneath the cap. And that's why they're called polypores. They've got these pores. And some of those are edible as well, and we can talk about that. But oyster mushrooms don't have that. Oyster mushrooms have true gills underneath, like we talked about earlier, and drop whitish to lavender spores. And they've got that nice soft mushroomy texture. And they're great and pretty easy to identify, hard to mistake for anything. The bigger species grows in cool weather. There's a smaller one that grows in the summer as well. And I just found some the other day. So that's one to watch out for. Another one that we find a lot is called lion's mane. Lion's mane is becoming really well known as an additive into food or as a supplement. So you'll see all kinds of drinks now that'll advertise they've got lion's mane in them, or you'll find the powder in a health food store. If you find, more and more you'll see like energy drinks that have mushroom written on them in some way. Lion's mane is usually one of the ingredients, and but you can find them wild in Mississippi. They are really cool. They grow in these big football-shaped clusters with down-hanging spikes that are like teeth or little icicles almost, and that's why it's called a lion's mane. It kind of looks like a beard or the mane of an animal, and they're white. And when they're fresh, they're really delicious. They have in contrast to oyster mushrooms, which have just kind of this nice mushroomy flavor. Lion's mane tends to be really like shellfish almost. You can it has a smell like crab, and you can kind of tear it apart like crab meat as well. And with those, I really like to treat them like crab meat and cook them like that. So you can mix them with breadcrumbs and onions and some egg to kind of bind them together into a patty, like a crab cake, and fry them in a pan just like that. Make a little, a mayonnaise sauce, and they're delicious. You can also just slice them and fry little patties of them with butter, and that's a really nice one to find. So watch for those growing up off the ground. They'll sometimes be on a fallen log, but they're often a little higher than you would expect. So you got to kind of keep your neck up and look up, or look out across the woods and look for a white cluster on a tree. Yeah. And to get them down, you often have to grab a big stick and kind of knock them off of the tree. Okay. And you can't often reach them.
December for that also?
Yep. Same time of year.
I wonder why that time of year.
Yeah, I don't know. We don't actually understand very well why certain mushrooms prefer hot weather, certain mushrooms prefer cold weather. There's times of year when it seems great for fungus growth from a naive human perspective, and we don't hardly find anything. Like April and May, I would expect there'd be all kinds of mushrooms out there, and there's fewer than you would expect. And then all of a sudden June hits and everything goes gangbusters again. So it's a bit of a mystery, but certain species grow in hot weather in the summer as long as there's enough rain. Chanterelles, for example, are very reliable in June if we've had enough rain.
Which
we have this year.
Had a lot, yeah.
So it's a good chanterelle year right now. You get out in your oak and hickory woods and walk around, and you should find these bright orange mushrooms growing in big patches. If you walk around enough, you'll find them. And that's true every year, unless we have a real dry late May, early June, it can kind of dry it up. And then you won't see them until we get a whole bunch of rain again, maybe July, maybe August, if we have a good rains later in the summer. Sometimes with hurricane season in the late summer, early fall, we can get a big flush of chanterelles coming out if there's a lot of rain associated with that. But yeah, the lion's mane and oyster mushrooms tend to prefer cooler weather. And there's quite a few species for which that's true. Chicken of the woods is another one.
Yeah, I've heard of that.
Yep, and that one tends to grow in cool weather as well, but also it'll grow in like late summer, early fall. There's two different species of chicken of the woods that look a little different. They have different colors, but they both have similar habits. That they're a polypore, as I mentioned before. Those are more leathery species that grow on the base of a tree or on a dead log, but they have a more like spongy, firm texture. And that's one you want to look up in a book or look up on the internet. It's a little hard to describe how to identify those, but there's two different species of them, but they have pores on the underside like a lot of polypores do. But these tend to be either white and pink or kind of yellow and orange, and kind of have a nice soft but firm, soft, spongy but firm texture to them. And they grow on also big overlapping layers, sort of like the oyster mushroom, but without the gills on the underside. They have little holes instead.
Okay.
Yeah.
As you describe them, myself, it's almost like there's this distant memory of seeing those things that you're talking about. I've seen them in the woods. I know I have. Certainly the oyster mushroom, I've seen a lot of that where I live in North Mississippi. But I guess overall what I was going to say is it does sound like you're simply not going to get good at identifying them unless you're out there and just doing it, finding it, get your hands on it, look it up. Like you say, go to the Facebook page, talk to an expert. Otherwise, you're really not going to have the confidence unless you put the time and the experience of finding them and looking it up, are you?
That's right. You shouldn't.
Yeah, you should.
Yeah. Some people probably have a little too much confidence too soon. And I would say what you really want to do is exactly how you described it, is put some time in, make an explicit effort to learn about it, learn how to identify them, get a book, talk to some people, engage with the other mushroom hunters in the Mississippi community, and make sure you know a little bit what you're doing, and confirm what you think is going on before you dive into it.
Sure.
That said, chanterelles and morels, there are a lot of people in Mississippi who routinely hunt them, and you should be able to find people in your local community who do that, and you can go out with them, or you can plan to connect with them and show them what you found. And it's not that hard to find people who can at least confirm those.
Yeah.
If you want to get more into identifying more of the different edible species and separating them from non-edible ones, and even just learning all the cool diversity, that's definitely a next step, I would say. But it's pretty easy to find people to show some potential morels to, or chanterelles.
Last question for me. For instance, those you mentioned, like the morels and chanterelles, are they ever cultivated? Has someone tried to, I'm going to create an atmosphere where I can actually kind of force these things to come?
Yeah, people have tried.
I would imagine,
but with not much success. A little bit of success with morels. You'll see there's some catalogs that you can find online that'll sell you a morel kit, and you can take the spawn and you can mix it with certain stuff. They'll tell you to mix it with sawdust and other materials, and then put it in a plot in your yard. I've tried it and it didn't work. I think probably it does work in some places, but I do know of one lab that has figured out how to grow them in the lab, but it's expensive, and it doesn't always work that well, and reportedly they don't taste as good. And so with certain mushrooms, you just can't grow them very well. Chanterelles, absolutely not. And part of the reason for that is that they depend on trees. So they're like truffles. If you want to grow a chanterelle, basically you have to create a forest. And and with truffles, it's lucrative enough for certain species of truffles that it's actually worth planting a whole oak forest. There's places in the southeast U.S. and up in Tennessee and in Australia and other parts of the world where they've actually planted oak forest. They found what they think is the right soil, and they inoculate the oaks with these European truffles with the spores from them, and they wait 7 years or longer and maybe get a bunch of truffles and eventually make their money from it. But it's a big endeavor and a big investment up front. Chanterelles are easy enough to find in nature that nobody has bothered trying to grow them, because why would you when it's pretty easy to find a whole bunch of them yourself. But those mushrooms that depend on trees for their lifestyle, those are the ones that are difficult to grow. Chanterelles you can't grow without an oak tree or a hickory or whatever. Same thing with truffles. The European truffles, they need oak trees. So you have to plant a whole oak forest. It would be the same thing with our pecan truffles. But you could be deliberate about the pecan truffles and try to inoculate pecan seedlings. And, I'd love to try that sometime. The mushrooms you find in the grocery store that are more common in the grocery store are the ones that are decomposers, because those you can grow with just sawdust or some other organic matter. So the store-bought, white button mushrooms, portobellos, creminis, that's all the same species, just grown in different ways. Those are grown on compost in a big warehouse, and that's easy. Same thing with oyster mushrooms. You can grow them, but that's because they're decomposers. You can grow them on a bag of sawdust. The ones that are easy to grow are the decomposers.
Okay.
The mycorrhizal ones are a whole nother story.
Whole nother story.
Yeah.
Well, the overall story, it's just really fascinating to hear someone like you even just give us a little tidbit of, the information that you've discovered and studied and learned over the years. Really fascinating, Jason. I just appreciate you coming by.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for the chance to talk.
He is Jason Hoeksema, professor of biology at Ole Miss, here on the show. Hope you enjoyed that. I know I did too. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you outdoors.